Around the year 500 BC, the Greek city-states began to culturally and economically flourish. Having several colonies scattered throughout the Mediterranean, the cities enhanced their wealth due to the trading networks controlled by the Greeks. However, this age of Greek prosperity was threatened by the Persian Empire, a military superpower which ruled the Middle East and part of Africa with hegemony. Without being able to pose resistance, the Greek colonies located in Asia Minor, currently Turkey, surrendered to the Persians and started to pay tribute to Emperor Darius. Weakening the Greek cities in Asia was part of the Persian strategy of domination in order to achieve total subjugation. After the conquest of the city of Byzantium, which opened the doors of the entire region of the Black Sea, the Phoenician traders were offered trading privileges, and these were the rivals of the Greeks in trading disputes. Such action prompted an extreme discontent among the Greeks. The wealthy Greek city of Miletus was deeply affected, since most of its wealth came from sea trade. Aware of the impending retaliation conducted by the Persian army, Miletus and its allies requested the help of several Hellenic polis in Greece. Nonetheless, few responded positively to the distress call. But the major city of Athens was among those who did, sending half of its naval fleet to help in the conflict. After gathering their armies, the Greeks marched against the city of Sardis, the regional headquarters of the Persian Empire. After conquering the city, the Greeks pillaged it and finally burned everything to ashes. Emperor Darius ordered the formation of a major army to crush the rebellion. The Persians gathered a large fleet of more than 600 war vessels and set sail towards Miletus, the rebellion's epicenter. By land, the Persian armies reconquered the lost territories at a slower pace. Close to Miletus, on the island of Lade, the Greek fleet protected the region. The rebels had approximately 350 war vessels, almost half of the total number of Persian vessels. However, the pedigree of the Greek vessels turned this fleet into a very dangerous enemy. The Persians knew that they had the advantage against the Greeks. However, they dreaded bloody combat since it would cause an irredeemable damage to its naval strength. And so, the Persians tried in many ways to avoid the conflict. The clash, nonetheless, appeared unavoidable. The two sides readied themselves to fight and were on a collision course. The valiant Greeks launched an attack against an opponent who was numerically superior, so the strategy was well plotted, making the most out of every vessel of their fleet. However, they were not ready for the betrayal that followed. Just when the clash had started, 60 Greek ships belonging to the island of Samos decided to leave the battle. They had established an agreement with the Persian Empire, with the latter forgiving the crimes of the former, and also granting trading benefits to the people of Samos. The withdrawal of Samos' fleet caused panic among the Greeks. Many Greek ships fled, foreseeing an impending massacre. As the battle unfurled, the ratio between Persian and Greek vessels went 3-1. The strategy outlined by the Greeks collapsed, and their vessels were very easy prey for the imperial forces. The Persian victory was decisive. The survivors of the Greek vessels returned to their homes. The rebel fleet was dissolved. After having assumed the control of the seas, defeating the Greeks inland was just a matter of time. King Darius ordained an exemplary punishment for the city of Miletus. The city was completely shattered. Its citizens were murdered or taken as slaves to Babylon. The Persians reconquered all the Greek cities in Asia Minor. However, Emperor Darius' wrath had yet to be curbed. He vowed to punish the nation that had dared to defy the biggest power the world had ever seen. The Persians had managed to asphyxiate the rebellion of the Greek cities in Asia Minor, which attempted to get rid of the Persian rule with the support from the city of Athens. Darius was determined to punish the city of Athens, so much so that the Emperor Darius ordered his servant to keep that in his mind. While serving the emperor's dinner, his servant would tell him, "Master, don't forget the Athenians." The Persians mobilized a large army and departed to Greece on their vessels. Among the Persians, the former Greek tyrant Hippias could be found. who had been expelled from Athens, a city that had become a democracy. If the Persians managed to dominate Greece, Hippias would become the ruler of the region, but would have to swear allegiance and pay tribute to the Persian Empire. And so, the former tyrant led the Persians to the beaches of the plain of Marathon, located next to the city of Athens. Realizing that the Persians were getting nearer, the Athenians sent their courier, Phidippides, to Sparta in order to ask for the latter's help. The Spartans replied, saying that they were celebrating Carnea and therefore could only send reinforcements after the 10-day feast. Led by the general Miltiades, approximately 10,000 Greeks headed towards the fields of Marathon. The Greek general strategically positioned his troops on the top of a hill. From up there, they spotted the enormous Persian army with approximately 50,000 units. Nonetheless, the clash took a long time to happen, because despite having fewer men, the defensive position at the top of the hill favored the Greeks, who were still expecting the reinforcements from Sparta. Adding to that, the Persians still believed that with Hippias' reappearances, troops loyal to the tyrant would split the Athenian army into two. Neither the Spartans emerged, nor did those who were loyal to Hippias. After a few days, the Persians decided to act. They decided to split their army, with more than 20,000 units embarking again in their vessels. Among the embarked troops, one could find the mighty Persian cavalry, always decisive in the battlefield. The Persians were planning to leave 30,000 troops with the mission to hold the Greek troops, while the ships with the remaining 20,000 men would go directly to Athens, which was unprotected. The city only had children, women, and old people. Women prayed to the goddess Athena, the goddess of strategic war, and Nike, the goddess of victory. They had been given orders to commit suicide if the Greeks lost against the Persians. The Athenians were in a rather difficult situation. Even after embarking almost half of their army, the Persian numbers inland were 3 times greater than the Greeks. However, General Miltiades, realizing that the Persians no longer had their cavalry, which was sailing to Athens, noticed that the Greeks could have an opportunity against the Persian army. The general decided to relinquish his strong defensive position and launch an attack. To match the length of the lengthy enemy line, Miltiades decided to stretch the phalanxes, which stood at the center of the formation, thus matching the length of the enemy line, hence preventing the Persians to flank the Greek units. The Greek general weakened the center of his formation and aligned the best troops at the flanks. His plan was to beat the enemy's flank with his lateral troops and then help those who were fighting at the center. It was an inventive plan, yet extremely risky. But ahead of them, they had to face yet another obstacle: the amazing Persian archers, deadly from a distance of 200 meters. The Greek phalanxes moved quite slowly in order to keep the formation aligned, and so they would be exposed to the devastating pouring of Persian arrows for a long time span. Miltiades did the unthinkable. He ordered the Greeks to run the final 100 meters to cross the death zone as fast as possible. The Persians were flabbergasted to see the Greeks running towards them. It was not normal at all to see a phalanx running, particularly if they had more than 30 kilograms of equipment. The rainfall of arrows barely had any consequence, and now the two troops were face to face and the bloodbath was about to unfurl. The one-on-one clash was intense. In the beginning, the Greek phalanxes, despite being weaker, were able to handle the wave of Persian attacks. However, due to a large number of Persian soldiers, the center of the Greek army started to give in. Realizing that they were about to win, Datis, the Persian general, strengthened the attack. The alignment of the Greek center was almost collapsing. However, the elite Greek troops fighting at the flanks managed to defeat the Persian opposition and moved towards the center to help their line. The Persian troops were now being attacked from 3 different directions. The panic began to spread among the Persians as they witnessed hundreds of their soldiers tumbling down. It was not just one more battle, it had become a massacre. The Persian soldiers began to fall by the thousands. Retreating was the only way out. The invading Persians ran desperately towards the vessels. The Greek victory was total. However, the Persian squad, which was heading towards Athens, still had to be taken into account. So, despite having been weighed down by battle, The Greeks quickly went back home to stand for it, but Miltiades remembered the orders given to the Greek women before the battle to kill themselves in case of a Greek defeat, and he feared that if the Persian vessels were spotted before the Athenian army, they would put that plan into motion. So the courier Pheidippides headed to Athens as quickly as possible. After completing 42 kilometers, he reached the central square of Athens, and using all the air he had left, yelled, "Victory!" collapsing dead right after that. His achievement is still remembered today with marathon events. When the Persians arrived at the port of Athens, they met Miltiades and his almost untouched army on the walls. During the Battle of Marathon, approximately 6,000 Persians died, but only 192 Greeks. Realizing that victory would be impossible, the Persian army ordered his vessels to turn back and head home. After the victory, and as a tribute to the gods, the edification of the Parthenon started, the most famous of all Greek monuments, and dedicated to the goddess Athena. A few days after the conflict, the tardy Spartan army finally arrived, stunned by the Athenian victory. They visited the field of Marathon, and faced with a pile of Persian corpses, perceived that the region had gained a new power. The victory of the Greeks in Marathon represents much more than a great military victory. We owe to those brave Greek warriors the existence of the essence of our Western culture. The Persian Empire had been defeated by the Greeks in the Battle of Marathon, but Emperor Darius sought revenge and began to assemble the greatest army that the old world had seen up to that point. But several uprisings within the Persian Empire postponed these plans. With the perishing of Emperor Darius, his son Xerxes assumed power and asphyxiated the rebellions in his empire, and now the emperor was free to move in motion his father's plans. 10 years had passed since his defeat at Marathon, but now the Persians had their mammoth army geared towards Greece. Under the command of Xerxes, a floating bridge connecting Asia to Europe was built so that the colossal Persian army could cross the Strait of the Dardanelles. At the army's vanguard, emissaries demanded the submission of Greek cities to the Persian Empire, being spared if they were accepted. The emissaries demanded from the Greeks an offering of land and water. After having heard what the emissaries had to say, the Spartans threw them into the pit and said they could have as much water as they wanted from down there. The Greeks gathered in the city of Corinth and constituted a great alliance in order to attempt to stop the Persian advance. The Athenians, commanded by Themistocles, would use their powerful fleet to fight the Persians by sea, whereas Leonidas, the king of Sparta, would lead the land troops and try to halt the Persians at the gates of fire at Thermopylae. But the city of Sparta was celebrating Carneia, a religious feast which forbade belligerent activities during its course. Leonidas consulted the oracle of Delphi, which told him that only a sacrifice of a legitimate heir to the throne of Hercules could detain the fury of the son of Perseus. According to Greek mythology, the hero Perseus had many descendants. Some of them had been the sprout of the people later known as Persians. On the other hand, Hercules' descendants ruled Sparta for several centuries already, and so Leonidas realized that his fate was to march against Xerxes. Unable to take his whole army with him, Leonidas handpicked 300 elite soldiers as his personal guard. On his way, he kept adding soldiers from other Greek cities. It is estimated that Leonidas managed to assemble an army of 7,000 soldiers from different backgrounds and led it toward the cliff of Thermopylae. The Spartans positioned themselves near the gates of fire, a strip of the cliff that was so narrow that the numerical superiority of the Persian army would be curbed. The gigantic Persian army was getting near, with more than 300,000 soldiers. Xerxes sent an emissary to meet the Spartan king. Xerxes proposed to Leonidas a unification between the Spartans and the Persians so that they could rule the whole of Greece under the flagship of the Persian Empire. The Spartan king rejected Xerxes' proposal, and his emissary threatened him. "Our arrows are so numerous that they will cover the whole sky." "Even better. We will fight in the shadows." The battle began, and the mighty Persian cavalry was borderline useless due to the wall of spears of the Greek phalanxes and the narrow room they had to move their units. The pouring of arrows was intense, but the Greek shields made the attack ineffective. The Persians had no alternative but to send their infantry for one-on-one combat. The outstanding phalanx formed by the Spartans repelled the waves of Persians' attacks, even defeating the division of Persian elite soldiers known as the Immortals. Xerxes was being humiliated by a couple of Greeks. The Greek strategy was working amazingly, but the Spartans were betrayed by a Greek called Ephialtes, who told the Persians about the routes used by shepherds, which would give them the chance to bypass the Greek defense. Realizing that they would end up surrounded, Leonidas freed the remaining Greek soldiers to retreat in order to prevent a massacre. Leonidas, his loyal Spartan soldiers, and about 1,000 Greeks readied themselves for the final battle. The Greeks fought bravely, but could not prevent the massacre that followed. After the end of the battle, Xerxes impaled Leonidas' head in a stake and marched victoriously towards Athens. The Persian victory represented a high cost in terms of lives and resources, allowing the Athenians to have 7 days to prepare themselves for the upcoming battle. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans became martyrs. Their heroic feats are still studied and celebrated. The Persian Empire had already launched its invasion of the Greek territory. Without finding much resistance, they kept subduing the Greek city-states along the way. But the route towards the domination of Greece would not be as easy as the Persians had forecasted. Many Greek cities came together to halt the Persian horde's advance. Over land, the Spartans tried to contain them in the gorge of Thermopylae. At sea, the Athenian fleet and its allies would play a decisive role. The Athenians were led by Themistocles, who, for more than 10 years before, had managed to convince the citizens of Athens of the importance of edifying a strong fleet, because he knew that the victory of the Greeks over the Persians at the Battle of Marathon was just the first of several that would follow. His war vessels were known as triremes, since they had 3 tiers of rowers, and they were the very best in terms of war vessels. In an initial stage, the fleet would give coverage to the Spartans who fought on land, hence preventing the Persian navy to disembark their troops in the rear of the Greeks fighting at Thermopylae. However, after the fall of Leonidas and his 300, Themistocles ordered his fleet to return to Athens. After having surpassed the Spartan blockade, the Persian army kept going and conquered city after city until they reached the gates of Athens. The city, for the most part, had been almost completely evacuated, aware that anyone who opted for staying in the city would be accepting their death sentence. Xerxes invaded the city, pillaging everything that he could and destroying everything that was left behind. He had fulfilled his father's wish to burn Athens to ashes. But his victory was not yet complete. The Athenian navy had to be defeated as well. The fleet was docked at the Straits of Salamis, near Athens. Themistocles found himself in a difficult situation. The ship ratio was 2-to-1 in favor of the Persians. Even though the Greeks had modern vessels, the Persian fleet was formed by experienced Phoenician and Egyptian sailors. Victory seemed impossible to reach. But Themistocles was already a thorough connoisseur of Persian strategies and realized that they always preferred to avoid direct and difficult clashes. They were always prone to rely on betrayals to streamline their paths. That was the situation in Miletus and Thermopylae, and so Salamis would not be any different. But this time, Themistocles would use a betrayal to his advantage. He sent his reliable servant on a mission to deceive Xerxes. The Greek man pretended to be a traitor and said he had valuable information to the Persians, which he would share in exchange for a reward. The Persians were curious to know what the traitor had to say. He disclosed the place where the Greek fleet was hidden, saying that the troops were disorganized and on the brink of defection. The Persian intelligence, with its clever spies, already knew that the Greek leaders were fighting between themselves, and they glimpsed a repetition of the Battle of Plataea, where the Greeks deserted during the fight, granting an easy victory to the Persians. Xerxes decided to send his great fleet for an attack against Greece and end the Greek navy once and for all. The Persian navy had bitten the bait of Themistocles and headed towards the Straits of Salamis. When entering the straits, the Persian vessels were astounded. What should have been a jumbled enemy was actually an opponent established in battle formation and motivated to stand up for their land. Akin to the Battle of Thermopylae, the Straits of Salamis neutralized the numerical advantage of the Persian vessels, as there was not much space to maneuver. The battle started, and the Greeks attacked the Persian vessels with their rams of bronze. many Persian vessels sunk right away. Those that managed to resist the impact were then approached, and a one-on-one fight would take place on the decks of the ships. The Greek vessels were more maneuverable, and so they started encircling the Persians. Even though the Persians had many ships, they got stuck, and so they started to collide and cause damage onto their own allies. Xerxes watched everything from a throne placed on top of the hill. He could not believe what was happening. The Persian war vessels were being sunk one by one. Thousands of soldiers were drowning or struggled for their lives amid the ships. The Persian men who could swim up to the beach were as unlikely as those who drowned, because, on the shores, Greek hoplites were ready to kill those who made it to the beach. The Persian defeat became evident after they lost 1/3 of their fleet, and so the admiral ordered a retreat. The Greek victory was decisive. Now Themistocles and his ships ruled the seas of Greece. Winter was coming. War would have to wait. Xerxes decided that the ruined city of Athens was no place for the king of the world, and so he decided to return to Asia. Nonetheless, a considerable part of his gigantic army stayed under the command of General Mardonius, having the mission to dominate the rest of Greece. The Persian Empire had shattered the city of Athens, but the disastrous Persian defeat in the naval Battle of Salamis eliminated any naval chances of a naval invasion of the Peloponnesus Peninsula. Xerxes returned to Asia with part of his army. Nevertheless, under the command of General Mardonius, he ended up with a major army whose intent was to dominate the rest of Greece. Mardonius kept conquering and looting the Greek cities he found on his way. The Spartan army and its allies stood up for the Strait of Isthmus, preventing the possibility of having the Persians marching towards the city of the Peloponnese. After subduing the entirety of northern Greece, the Persian army headed south, with the mission of achieving the full conquest of Greece. The Persian troops were camped near the town of Plataea in the region of Boeotia. This was an army about 300,000 soldiers stationed near the edge of the Asopos River. From the top of the mountains near the city of Plataea appeared the Greek army, led by the interim king Pausanias, who replaced King Leonidas, the king who died at Thermopylae. Pausanias would have the seat until the deceased son reached the age to reign. These were approximately 40,000 hoplites and 60,000 auxiliary troops gathered from the most various Greek cities. The Greeks settled themselves on the top of the mountain since it was an excellent defensive position. On the left side of the Greek formation were the Athenians. In the center, they had a mishmash of several Greek polis, and on the right, which was the position of honor, were the Spartan soldiers. Several days passed, and both armies stared at each other, conducting sacrifices to gods, waiting for an auspicious sign to launch an attack. General Mardonius ordered his horse-riding archers to fustigate the Greek lines with their arrows with the purpose of weakening their morale. However, the move backfired. The noble officer who commanded the Persian attack was killed by the Greeks. This encouraged them to reposition themselves closer to the Persian army. None of the two armies dared to attack. The Greeks dreaded a clash against the Persian cavalry in open field, and the Persians knew that the positioning of the Greek troops favored the defenders. The Persian cavalry managed to achieve a major victory, conquering the spring of water that supplied the Greek army. The Spartans and their allies were now in quite a delicate situation. Starving and thirsty, it was impossible to maintain the position indefinitely, and attacking did not seem to be a viable alternative. The Greeks decided to retreat, but since it was an army formed by units of different origins, the move was very disorganized. Mardonius, perceiving the chaotic retreat of the Greeks, believed that the enemy army was in panic. He ordered all his troops to launch an attack. The Theban phalanx, who had allied with the Persians, advanced against the Athenians, prompting a classic battle of Greek hoplites. In the meantime, the bulk of the Persian army went after the Spartans. The cavalry tried to decimate them, but was repulsed by the wall of Spartan spears. The Persian infantry advanced over the hill, but waited for the archers to weaken the enemy lines. The Spartans protected themselves from the pouring of arrows and launched a counterattack. Aided by gravity while descending the hill, the Spartan phalanx exploded against the enemy line. The bloodbath began. The discipline, strength, and courage of the Spartan soldiers allowed them to fight on equal terms against a much larger army. The Spartans started to push the Persian lines back, and were getting near Mardonius and his personal guard. The Persian general, on his horse, led his troops bravely and had the dream to reign over Greece in the name of Xerxes. But he did not foresee what was about to happen. A Spartan grabbed a stone from the ground and threw it against Mardonius. He was hit on the head and dropped dead from his horse. Seeing their general falling, the Persian army panicked and disorderly fled from the battlefield. Those who kept fighting were massacred. Those who fled to the city of Thebes were rounded up and executed. The Persian defeat was complete. The Persian army had been destroyed. Greece was finally free of the invaders. After the battle, the Spartan general Pausanias approached the Persian camp, which had been abandoned during the enemy's escape. The Greeks were impressed with the wealth and luxury contained in the tent of General Mardonius, who had been Xerxes' personal tent during the first phase of the invasion. Witnessing the wealth of the Persians, the richest of the Greeks felt penniless. During his march, Xerxes looted and plundered several Greek cities, but in the end, he couldn't steal the greatest Greek treasure, which was their freedom.